brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
All right, this is our episode 20, and we're starting to do the Persians and early Persians and the entire Persian world, pretty much. Now, what I'm doing is, in order to understand the Persian mentality, to understand the entirety of the Persian Empire, we really gotta start kind of early on. We gotta start with the understanding of the Persian world view. And before we go to discuss the religious and the overall worldview of the people who will later become the Persians, I just want to send out a shout to Marvine. I also want to send a shout out to the Bushwhacker podcast. And I want to say, if anybody is watching this video and you like what we're doing, please like us. That helps a lot. If you don't like it, then go ahead and dislike it. Either way. Alrighty. So why, generally in the Western world, and this by Western world, I mean both the East and the West, really the European world, Persians are really not given their due. We know very little about them. We know the Prince of Persia. Some people have seen the movie 300, which gives you a horrible idea about what the Persians were like, and we don't know much of anything else about them. Why don't we know that much about an empire that lasted a very long time, that was one of the greatest political and social and just cultural contributors to our time? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, the Persians themselves did not believe in writing down anything other than bureaucratic stuff. They believed that writing down spoken language kind of murdered the language, that it was almost sacrilegious. And so until the very late, the very last part of the life of the Persian Empire, almost no texts were written down. The only things that were written down were not the spiritual things. They were either the bureaucratic notes, or they were some political notes. They really did not like using writing at all. So we have very little about the Persians from their own voice. What we have instead is a Greek-centric view, because the Greeks, unlike the Persians, liked to write, and they wrote a lot. And so we kind of seeing Persian Empire through the eyes of their enemy, really, and their opponent. It's a lot like studying the USSR through the chronicles of, for example, German side of the war. It's very one-sided. It's very skewed. And the third reason is because the region, once it got conquered by the new and upcoming Arabian kind of Islamic peoples, they were not so partial to the conquered people's cultures at that time, and so they pretty much cleaned up everything that they did not deem to be appropriate to their own worldview, religion, and their own doctrine. So between those three reasons, I mean, there are several others, but really the European-centric view, the Greek-centric view, the conquest that overlaid the historical and the cultural achievements of Persia has more or less wiped out that part of the world from our memory, and that's unfortunate. So in this episode, what I want to do is I want to talk about the driving morale, the driving doctrine, the driving religion behind the Persians. And that's, of course, Zoroastrianism, which again is very little known in the Western world. And there are still practicing Zoroastrian communities around the world. There are some in Iran, there are some here in the United States, there are some in the former Soviet republics, especially Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, places like that, Turkmenistan. I know that there's one really blooming community in Moscow, but of course, and in India, of course, there's the Indian community, but of course, those are very far from the original Zoroastrian approach, as was written in the text that is now known as the Avesta. In order to understand the development and the reasoning behind this religion, we need to understand a little bit more about what was going on in the homeland of these peoples when this religion took place. And of course, once again, we've talked about the Aryans. We had a special episode for the Aryans, but we're going to repeat some of those facts in this one and kind of go into greater detail about some of those beliefs, because they are important to understand what it is that basically the Zoroastrian religion rebelled against, what the people were dealing with. So our main sources, as I mentioned before, knowledge about ancient beliefs in the homeland, which is called Aryan Voyage. And it's a kind of a mythological land. It's not a land that has been geographically located by the modern researchers, but they're guessing that it was probably somewhere where basically in the steppe region, somewhere between Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Russia, plus or minus, because as any nomadic people, the early Aryans migrated back and forth quite a bit. And actually, I'm not gonna have a lot of images this time around, but I'm gonna pull up a couple of maps. And this is a map that we're gonna come back to over and over again. Again, I apologize. This is a Russian map. The English map that I tried to download was copyright protected, so I wasn't able to do so. And this is a genetic migration map, and we will return to it over and over as we speak about the migrations. But we've discussed in the episode when we were talking about the Aryans, Arkaim, which is a place where the very earliest chariots were found, and Arkaim is right in this area right here. And then roughly this area right here is Aryan Voyage. Possibly, potentially. Now, another thing that you got to understand about the homeland of the Aryans and this mythological Aryan Voyage is as the time went on. As the time went on, the location of this place in the heads of the people who were talking about it changed as well. Just like Jerusalem in later Christian Europe has traveled back and forth across the globe to different countries and different locales, as basically just being a mythological center of the Christian world. The same way Aryan Voyage moved back and forth depending on where the people talking about it moved to themselves. And so different peoples migrated out of this land in different times. They think that there was 3 major waves of migration. A lot of this is still being debated. A lot of this is still up for scientific discovery, research, and there's no single opinion on even what to call these peoples and these different branches of these peoples, let alone what time they left, where they migrated. But there's some general ideas. Aryans gave rise to, of course, we've talked about such people as the Hittites, the Mettonites. For example, here's, Hittites are right here, the Mettonites are right here. Then Celts, Italics, Greeks, couple of waves of Greeks. The Carians, which went all the way to China, which are not represented on this map. Like I said, this is a genetic migration map. Celts, Indians, Persians, Goths, Slavs, Balts, Scythians, all those peoples are considered to, Armenians, they're all considered to be basically originally Proto-Aryan people that later broke off. And each one of them took a snapshot of their culture and of their religion. And that's how we are able to partially reconstruct what they believed in and what their life was like. But we also have 2 sources that neither one of which was originally written down, but were written down later from memories of because in both of those cultures, the tradition of the spoken word was so big that people tried to memorize their holy texts word for word and literally comma for comma, and they remember them literally through generations. So people later were able to come in, write down those texts, even if the people who themselves remember those texts, if the populations who have kind of transferred forth that tradition no longer even remembered what they were talking about. They didn't even understand the language because the language over the centuries has changed. They only remembered the memorized sounds. So it was interesting, for example, with Avesta, British researchers who were able to decipher it, they then had to came back to the community and basically told them, look, this is what you've been saying all along. This is what your hymns that you've been singing and memorizing actually mean. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen. And David is going to try to share his because I found it. Meanwhile, I can go ahead and keep talking. So at the time, the word Arya, which became a very negative word in Western culture. Your camera is pointing at the roof. But the word Aryan actually was just what the people called themselves in the Vedas, and all it means is the upper class people. It means highborn or culturally, ritually clean, or noble, basically. And the same, for example, in the name of the mountain Ararat, all it means is high mountain, right? That's the same R root. And as I mentioned before, in the names of the countries such as Armenia, such as Ireland, such as Iran, even, that's all the same word. It's the same word, Arya. And they had a group of warlords or kind of chieftains of people who were of the warrior class, and they were called K or Kai or Kavi. So I'm going to use Kavi for the purpose of our conversation. But from that same Kai, K, Kavi, then the name of the city Kiev is born from. So when Kiev was basically a city of the Lord, the city Lord ruled by Konung. That sort of Konung, by the way, originates from the same, though through some complicated transmutation. And these K, they started becoming prominent in the original territory in the homeland of Aryan Voyage. And now these people, they were nomadic herders, the horse culture. They were using a lot of chariots, and the warrior culture started emerging. Well, the warriors, these little chieftains or warlords, they started organizing themselves into groups and kind of terrorizing the common shepherds who were busy just doing their everyday work in herding their cows, which was their primary source of meat. For the Kavi and the primary source of everything else for the common folk. And that was a big issue and one of the big reasons why the break happened. That's going to happen shortly. So each Kavi started having a couple of helpers. And again, this is a very interesting snapshot in history that we find out they had both priests and shamans in their culture. And this is something we learn from the Avesta. And the actual author of the Avesta, Zoroaster, who is kind of the prophet of the Zoroastrian religion. Oops, we have somebody joining us. He talks about that's where we know these things. He talks about how the Kavias surrounding themselves with the priests, which were called the Zotars, or later became called Atravan in the culture, and also shamans, which there were two kinds of. And you remember we talked about white and black shamans. Those are not good and evil shamans. It's just one is called the matron, and it's the singer. It's the one who tries to convince, coax, trick, sweet talk the spirits into cooperating. And then Karapan is the whisperer, and he is the one who threatens, who terrifies, who basically blackmails the spirits and forcibly controls the spirits. So towards the time when our Zoroastrianism as a religion starts budding, when the great revelation happens, Kavi stopped using the services of Matran, of the white shamans, of the ones who were singing and talking and trying to be cooperating with the spirits. And they mostly surrounded themselves with the Zotars, which knew the rituals and helped the lords in their practice of religious rites. And also just with the Karapans, and had no interest in really dealing with the white shamans anymore. So, and of course, the society started breaking up into three layers, and that's something we're going to see in all European, Indian, Iranian, really any Aryan-based societies. And that's, of course, your lords, then your religious peoples, which were basically the priests, and of course, below that would be your commoners, common shepherds, or common people who work on the land. Later on in this culture, it was mostly shepherds. And originally, this whole society worshipped chthonic deities. By chthonic, I mean earthly gods, forces of nature, things that were not really human-like, that didn't really have a human appearance at all, that were more gigantic, sometimes very dark, but very uncontrollable basic entities. And they had very important entity for the sky. And that's, we will later see the same entity mentioned as Tengri in Mongolian, for example, shamanism. But these guys, the Aryans, their name for the sky was Deos. And it's a word that we need to remember, Deos. They also had the wind, which is not going to be Viaus, for example, is one of the way of what you call the wind. And these deities were neither good or bad, because the sky can give you warmth and can be welcoming, or it can give you storms. The wind could be pleasant breeze, or it could be some sort of a horrible hurricane, right? Then they had the sun, and this is something that might sound familiar, and the name for the sun was Sol or Zeus, but it went by a nickname of horse. And it was often represented in this early stage as a kind of a fiery horse in the sky. The earth was under the control of a very important deity that was known as Vrts, or Vus, or Vrt. So his names would be, in Russian, it would be Veles, Vitas, Vetra. It basically was represented by a giant lizard-like dragon, and was known to be in charge of all the precious metals and all the sources within the earth itself, also responsible for allowing people to obtain those sources, and it is what gave rise to the European version of the dragon. And of course, fire was very important for us, and it was known as Yagn or Agni or Ogon. In Russian, fire is Огонь, for example, Ogon, Agn, Agno. And the water goddess, we've discussed this in one of the past episodes, of course, was Dana or Danu or Dn. And she was just a giant, enormous river, like the great river. Very dark, very powerful goddess, very powerful force. And she's actually superseded the ocean because to the Aryans, they didn't know oceans. They knew the seas and where they lived. They lived right around the Aral Sea. And that sea is fairly small, so they could actually migrate around it. But they couldn't cross some of the larger rivers. So to them, rivers seemed more powerful, more intense of a force of nature than actually a sea. Later on in later mythology, when the new gods arise, there's a fight between them and Danu, this goddess, and she gets actually. Oh, yeah, David is sharing, I guess.
Sorry.
It's okay. Will you point at the right places so where the Aral Sea is? You don't even have the Aral Sea on here. You don't have the Aral Sea on here, though, do you?
It's right there.
Yeah, the Aral Sea today has pretty much dried up altogether. So, yeah.
Yeah, and
You just leave this up for a second because I'm going to be using. So anyway, so.
these two cultures right there are the Iranian and Indian branches of the Indo-European family.
Can you guys hear me okay? Because I think I'm coming through David's computer. You can hear me okay? Okay, so Dana later on was when the new gods arise. She goes, the legend says that she fought with them, was defeated, and basically exiled out of the Aryan Voyage. And she is the same goddess that is later becomes, mentioned as the goddess Dana in the Celtic religion in Ireland. She is the basically the creature that is known, when you speak of the tribes of the Danu, of goddess Danu, that's whom we're talking about. It's the Celts, and that's a memory of this ancient goddess in their homeland. According to some religious traditions, she gives birth to what creatures known as Danava, and they are treated as demons. In India, they're considered to be not necessarily positive, but at least neutral entities in Celtic worldviews. And you can see where the Celts traveled. Celts were one of the earliest groups to break out from the, and right here, if you can point to the Celts for me, please.
Right here.
Yeah, well,
They branched out from the Germans and the Italics in the Danube Valley. You will remember the Yamna culture here.
Yamna culture is basically the Kurgan culture.
The current culture to
all of these. Yeah, to make long story very, very short.
Right.
There was a couple waves of migration, but you can see where the Mitanni, for example, so you will see our main groups here. So it is believed that probably the Hittites were the very first ones to break off, and it's because we don't see any mention of any of this religious split in the Hittites. So let me finish really quick about the Dana goddess. So the Dana goddess comes up as the Celts were traveling out of their homeland. You see all these rivers named Don, Dnieper, Dniester, Dunai. That's the Celts coming across in yet another river and giving them names that all refer to the goddess Dana, like fast waters, slow waters, foaming waters, black waters, and so on and so forth. In Armenia, for example, the name Anais or Tanais, which is another version of the name Danu, is still a very popular name for girls. It's actually one of the top popular names in the country of Armenia. And it is a very, very powerful goddess that got exiled, and that legendary exile is really paralleled in the actual exodus of the Celts, most likely. I mean, this is a hypothesis, but it's a worthwhile one. It's a worthwhile one. So these were the old Tonic gods, and they were known as the Ahurs. Masters or keepers of the forest, keepers of the rivers, keepers of the sky, so on and so forth. Well, what started happening when this warrior class started coming up as a new class of deities appeared, and these were very anthropomorphic, very human-like warrior gods. And of those main gods, of course, the number one is Indra, and this is your chariot riding, lightning wielding, who uses a special rod for throwing his lightning. Can you stop sharing screen so I can go back for a second? Okay, so he is, he has a special rod in some religions. This rod is called Perun, and in some religions, the god himself takes on the name Perun. But Indra is the god of happy, exciting, glorious, kind of joyful warfare. He is later seen in Tantras. He is seen in Zeus, even in the name of Zeus. Even though in the name of Zeus we have that name Deus, but the actual functions of Zeus are more akin to actual Indra. Perun in Russia, Tur in Scandinavian religions, not Thor, but Tur, and partially even in Jupiter. He is the god who defeats and humiliates Veles, the earth deity, the great dragon. He skins him, takes off his hide, and then rides him, and that way becomes the leader of gods, according to legend. And of course, he has a brother whose name is very well known to everyone, and that's Mitra, which in itself means agreement or a treaty or some sort of a compromise. And it's a god of level-headed, responsible war, and he is the protector god of the of the regular warrior, not necessarily the lord. And of course, later on, there appears a third brother, and that's Rudra, and that's the word that is synonymous with rage, was the word red, was blood and destruction. And his nickname, of course, later on will be Shiva. You can follow these religious changes, these religious you can use this progression in the changes in the religion of the people by following the different migration waves out of the original homeland. The Hittites wandered out first, and they really don't have any of these new gods. I mean, they have the new gods, but it's all kind of intermixed together still, right? Where the chthonic gods and the budding elite gods, for lack of a better term, these anthropomorphic warrior gods, they are still kind of all one and the same. The Celts seem to depart at some point in time, and again, the chronology is kind of very up for debate. But the Celts seem to depart fairly early because they take with them this very chthonic goddess Donna, and that coincides with the legend about Donna being exiled within the remaining society. The Mitanni, their religion actually had at its basis the twin brothers. They have both Mitra and Indra, that they're still equal at that point in time. And so both of them prominent gods, they're twin gods. Some of the other migrations, for example, we don't know much about the Italics because there was so much admixture with the Etruscans and everyone else. But for example, the Greeks, both the Achaean and the Dorian Greeks later on, they definitely took with them the later version. Now the names, again, I mentioned the names for the old deities were known as the Hurs, and the name for the new deities was Div or Diva. So Divo, the society that worships Divos or Divs is a society that worships the warrior culture, and that's would be your Greek society, for example, where you have Zeus and very much kind of male-centric. And another big thing that went with the split, of course, was the treatment of the cow. The common folk who only had one or two cows to their name didn't kill their cow, they didn't eat their cow, they milked their cow, they made cheese, they made other milk products out of the milk, and they considered this cow to be their sacred protector. I mean, as a matter of fact, and I've mentioned it before, the legend that the Aryans had that coincides to the flood legend is actually the legend of the great snow that lasted for such a long such a long time that for almost 3.5 years, the very first man, known as Im, had to build a bunker where the people was like multi-layered bunker where people had to hide out from the horrible snowstorm. And the kind cow came to them and taught them how to milk her and provided them with food this whole time. So to common folk, the cow was she was sacred. The cow was wise, the cow was the savior, the protector. You don't eat your cow, you never eat your cow. To the budding ruling class, the cow was, first of all, a source of meat. And of course, neither class ate the cows under normal circumstances, but the budding warrior class decided that they wanted to sacrifice the most precious thing that they had, their cows, to their gods, to their warrior gods. And of course, to be really cool, they started sacrificing these cows, not one, not two, but hundreds of them. Such sacrifices later will be known in ancient Greece. Getakom, I believe they're called, when you have, great monumental sacrifice to, let's say, Zeus, and there's 100 cows at once, or bulls or whatever. And once you sacrifice those animals, well, then it was not sacrilegious to eat them because they already been sacrificed to the gods. So what started happening is the lords started chasing down the shepherds and taking away their cows. And instead of just taking away their cows to milk them, they would take away their cows and murder them and eat them. And of course, to the shepherds, that was absolutely horrific thing. I mean, it's, you know, they would have been better off taking their kids, basically. I mean, to take that cow was just, it was unbelievable. It was horrific. It was taking away their way of life, their way of acquiring any sort of food sources, and it was taking away basically a family member, a protector, and a sacred creature. So there was a lot of tension that started growing between those two groups. And that is when, sorry, total blink for a second. Okay, I already went over all of this. Da, da, da. Oh, and there was a difference with the way, of course, they sacrificed, the elites would sacrifice the cows to their gods, and to where they, you know, the common folks would sacrifice either haoma, burn incense, you know, stuff like that. So completely non-blood sacrifices. For them, the cow was renewable food source, and basically an economic basis that was being undermined. So the Kavi, these warlords, they were stealing the cows, and the people started having a problem with that. Well, meanwhile, in this area lived back then, probably what would be considered a middle-aged man, a 30-year-old Zoroaster, son of Zoroaster. I'm going to be pronouncing all the words here in actual Iranian fashion, because in the Persian fashion, because I'm trying to kind of put us inside of this culture. So Zoroaster, who was the son of Puashatra, his name meant the owner of old camels. And it's when people argued and tried to say that he was an invented character or some sort of legendary person, it's very hard to imagine that the peoples would invent the character and give him a name, an owner of an old camel. Most likely he was a real man, and there's other good indications to believe that he was a real man, and we will talk a little bit about that later on. But a lot of the names that we have in the Western culture, they come from the Greeks. The Greeks could not pronounce half of the letters in the Aryan alphabet and the Persian alphabet. So, for example, Cyrus is the Great. You know, in Russia he's pronounced as Kir, and then in Persian he was pronounced as Kurush. Darius, as we all have heard and know who Darius is, well, his actual name was Darivansh. So the Greeks just had a real hard time pronouncing a lot of these words, like really hard time. So they would just kind of mingle them. And so this was all happening approximately about 1500 BC plus or minus. Avestan is a separate language. It's the early Persian language. There's a name for it. And it's named after this, I don't want to say document, it's an oral tradition, holy hymn, holy body of works that is believed and more or less proven to be composed by one individual. It's known as the Avesta. And what does the Avesta tell us? Well, the Avesta is the text that Zoroaster wrote throughout his life, about his life. And it's not a very happy text. It's actually very, out of all the books, you know, of the great revelation religions, there's very little umph in it. It's very down to earth and realistic. He is 30 years old. His life sucks. You know, all the Kavi around him are robbing all the shepherds of their cows. The shepherds are having hard times. All the Kavi, the lords around him, are not liking the white shamans anymore. They only have the black shamans in their courts, and then they have the priests. And he, our poor Zoroaster, he happens to be actually a white shaman and a priest. So he's both a Zoroaster and he is also a Mandarin. So that means that he is completely not welcomed in any court. He wanders to one warlord and gets kicked out. He wanders to another warlord and his services are not needed. He's not doing very well in life. Now he has a wife, a couple of kids, a part of a small, rather poor tribe, and an owner of some old camels. Well, one day, our main character goes into a river to ritually wash himself. And when he's done ritually cleansing himself, and the, you know, Aryans, the Persians, they were all really big about being just physically, ritualistically clean. As he is coming out of the water in this clean and renewed state, he sees it. This thing comes to him. And the way that he describes it is very interesting. He describes it as a really shining, bright flame, glorious flame that is both awe-inspiring and overwhelming and terrifying, but mostly soothing and glorious. And it's 7 flames in one. But these flames, they're also individuals. And what those individuals, there's 4 men and 3 women that appear before him. And out of this flame, no voice speaks to him. what happens is information literally gets uploaded to his brain. And the way that he describes it, it's if we were to talk in kind of a computer tech, it got uploaded to his brain, but it would only activate at certain points in time in his life, because the way that he says himself, that if he knew all that at once, he would have just gone mad. So the knowledge was input, and we would say it was input into his brain. What they would say it was input into his liver, because back then they believed that people thought was their liver. But this knowledge was stored in him, and as it was, as he was progressing throughout his life, it would appear like other chunks of it would suddenly come up to the surface. His experience seems to be a fairly genuine revelation, and he was so inspired by this amazing experience, he immediately ran to his little camp, and he ran to his wife and his kids and his couple of kinsmen and told them all about this great vision he just had. But not a vision encounter even. And they all believed him, were very inspired, and they immediately converted. Well, then he ran to the nearby Kavi and tried to tell the nearby Lord what he just seen and what a great revelation he just had. And he pretty much got beat up and kicked out. And that continued to be his life for the next couple of decades. Well, what did this great deity tell him? This great deity told him that it was the creator of this world. That it was the creator of this world, but it had a twin. And there was a battle raging somewhere in basically celestial spheres for the fate of this world. And while this deity represented order and all good things, all the pleasant things, its twin brother, its twin, I guess, opponent, represented chaos, destruction. So, for example, the deity would invent such things as good, yummy food, and the twin brother would invent such thing as obesity. It would invent such things as love, and its brother would invent such thing as, rape and uncontrollable lust and perversions. It would invent such things as happy societies, and its counterpart would invent such things as war and destruction and senseless slaughter. And the name of this thing was Amersha Spenta, translated as indestructible divinity. And it's kind of an abstract entity, an abstract being. The name of its opponent, of the enemy twin brother, was actually Andra Minum, and that was the force, that was the destructive force of chaos. And so Amersha Spenta turned the one of the seven faces, and the seven faces of this creature, they're kind of like avatars. They're kind of like computer interfaces. For example, the one that's called Ahura Mazda, which you hear about most often when you hear about Persian religion, is the interface that's specifically designed for talking to human beings. It has many other kind of avatars or interfaces, but we'll talk a little bit about the other ones, but that's the one that most people would interact with, because the rest of them are just not very geared for humanoid consumption, I guess. So it said that, look, you're the only one who can hear me. I've created this world and everything's just going really shitty here. I need your help. Yes, I know you just nobody, was just some old camels, but I need you to go out there and try to bring the truth to the people. The people have gone crazy. They're destroying the world. They're destroying the environment. They're shitting in the river. They're desecrating the fires. They're not honoring the old gods. They were worshiping these other gods, the devas, which have been corrupted and taken over by my enemy, by the Andromino, and that are leading them astray towards destruction, senseless slaughter, and killing of wonderful cows. So you need to explain to people that if they continue that way, the world is going to not end very well. Now, I'm not almighty. I'm not omnipresent. I can help you a little bit. Most of this is on you. You're my last hope. It's going to be hard. I'm not sure you're going to succeed, but look, you need to go out and you need to do this for me. And so it's just like, are you sure you want me to do this? I'm nobody. And, the deity tells him, look, I don't have anybody else. You have to be the one. You have to do it. It's going to be hard. I'll do what I can. And, Zarathustra says, okay, I will try. And so he tries and he tries and he tries again. And everywhere he goes, he gets laughed at, ridiculed, beat up, and kicked out. Because every time now, what does this thing preach? The main things that this entity wants of humans. Stop senseless slaughter of people, and please stop senseless slaughter of wonderful, holy cows. That is just homicidal madness. Don't shit in the river. Don't spit in the fire. Don't piss in the fire. Honor the old forces, all the natural forces. They're pure. They're my helpers. They're known as the Ahurs. They're good deities. They're natural chthonic deities. It's a very ecological point of view. Basically, don't dirty your environment around you. Don't desecrate various natural habitats, and don't touch dead things. Dead bodies are yuck. They're unclean. They're filthy. They're anything that's rotten, anything that is decaying, anything that's dead. You people should not touch it. Oh, and be nice to dogs. I mean, those are the basic doctrines. Be nice to people. Just try to be a decent person. Don't try to cause war unless you absolutely have to. And in general, try to do peaceful things and be productive in life, and just enjoy life and don't be a jerk. Well, when he comes to all these Kavis and tells them you're not supposed to be sacrificing cows anymore, they don't take that very kindly. They're glorious war gods. They want those cow sacrifices. They think they're cool because that's what their gods demand. And so he wanders around. He's getting pretty desperate by this point in time. He manages to gain a couple of followers, a couple dozen maybe. Then slowly, one by one, these followers all drop off from him. And it's just him and his immediate family, couple of relatives, couple of really diehard disciples. At one point in time, people get so sick of his preaching that they decide that they're going to kill him. And as they're getting him ready to basically have him killed, actually a herd of cows runs by and distracts his attackers. And he is able to untie himself and run away, but he describes that as a great help from his God, that the herd of cows was sent as his saviors. So he decides, okay, I'm going to change my doctrine. Nobody's listening to me. Nobody wants to do things. Okay, I'm not really a military person. Maybe I do need to find me a champion. And here, there's actually one of the goddess that I was trying. Oh, by the way, the little songs, the little sections, not little, but the sections within the Avesta themselves are known as the goddess. And so there's one that's is written from the point of view of the cow. And the cow is lamenting about how people are not treating it nice, how it's been very nice to people and people are just not being nice to it. They're murdering it. They're basically raping and pillaging. They're being not very nice individuals. That, all that the cow has for her champion is this useless old man who cannot even speak normally and convert anyone, and how it needs a better champion, somebody, a shining champion, a warrior, a true protector. And that indicates a point in time, in Zoroaster, who is very depressed by this point in time and kind of feeling hopeless, that maybe I should try something different. And he decides, I need to find me a lord that will align with me somehow. Well, one of his followers says, you know what, I know somebody like that. I know this particular warlord that's just down on his luck. He used to be very strong, very powerful, very good commander, but he lost a couple of battles, got kind of kicked out of the whole society, and now he's pretty much kind of meandering with a few followers, and he's hopeless enough he might listen to you. And, Zoroaster says, okay, let's try that. So they go and they find this Kavi. And this Kavi's name, okay, hold on, I got to make sure that I tell you the right one. His name is Kavi Wishtashpa. And this guy is very much, he's just on the outskirts of the society. He's down on his luck. And Zarathustra, he comes to him and he talks to him, and they talk for 3.5 months in depth. They have long conversations, and the Kavi decides, what the heck, I've got nothing to lose. Let's try this. And so the first thing the Kavi does is that he starts handing out weapons to common shepherds. Now, that's something that's taboo in the society by this point in time, because anytime the elite comes to control a society, usually the first thing they do is disarm the general populace. But this guy's breaking the taboo. He's handing out weapons. He's handing out chariots to common shepherds. And, he starts doing battle on his enemies and on all these other Kavis who are robbing the shepherds of their herds, and they start winning. And of course, the more they start winning, the more shepherds start flocking to them. And for a while, he's doing quite well. He seems to be victorious. But then all the other Kavi, when they see this nonsense, get very upset, and they all unite together against him. And they all drive him out of Aryan Voyage. And Zarathustra says, okay, you know what? This land is cursed. He curses Aryan Voyage, says we're going to go out there beyond the edge. We're going to be the people who live beyond the edge, and we're going to find ourselves new land. And these are the people who call themselves Parsa. And Parsa means people beyond the beyond the border, beyond the edge of the world. Okay, I'm going to stop and see if anybody has anything to say. Anyone?
Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Hi.
It's the cattle culture and the mythology of the cattle culture is amazingly parallel with the Bantu tribes in Africa, the semi-nomadic cattle herding tribes, and world, what do you call it? Their mythology is strikingly similarly constructed. And I'm just saying this as an observation, and just putting it out there, maybe perhaps for future conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point of view. I want to look into it because I really don't know much about it for sure.
Yeah.
But thank you. David was going to jump in, so I'm going to turn off my stuff 1 second.
Just let me be clear, just on some of the timing of this. We're looking around 1500 BC, plus or minus, like she said. And the peoples are kind of to the east of the Caspian Sea. The groups that would become the Persians would go west into Iran. The ones that would become the Indo-Aryan peoples of northern India would go south or across the Hindu Kush. And apparently Zoroaster, Zarathustra, was alive about the time they started breaking off. Interestingly, you will remember we talked about the Mitanni. They were still, their religion seems to be more related to the Rig Veda, the Indian populations. Just wanted to mention that. And yes, those were to address Nathan's point, those were the only two societies, the Indo-Europeans and the Bantu peoples, where lactose tolerance would develop, but they could eat cheese even before they could drink milk. So that's why, to the common peasant, that cow was important.
Say that that's interesting, especially what David said about the whole, eating cheese versus milk. The cow actually being a very big part of even a family structure, and you don't eat the cow, that seems to trickle on down for quite a while, at least from the stories that I grew up as a child. But it's pretty clear that even if you are lactose intolerant, you might be able to eat certain harder cheeses. But yeah, drinking milk is a staple, maybe not. So kind of interesting thoughts there.
Yeah, no, for example, with the modern Mongolian cultures, Mongolians don't have the lactose tolerance that the Europeans do, but they have an actually like intestinal gut bacteria that helps them break it down. So even though they don't have that gene for lactose tolerance, they have a different way of dealing with lactose, with milk products. So it's possible that early peoples might have dealt with it differently too. I mean, there's just different evolutionary and, environmental adaptations that you can use to kind of trick that system within yourself. Nathan?
Yes, and also the methodology they developed to actually pull blood from the cow without killing it.
Right, horses with Mongols.
Right, and so I'm very curious if the Persians, if they had developed a similar method of drawing blood from an animal without killing it.
I strongly suspect that they have, and the reason I have not met anything in the literature about the Aryans doing that, but because we know that Mongolians do that with their horses, and we know that Mongolians have inherited a lot of their cultural complex from those nomadic Aryan tribes, just because those tribes were the first ones to invent the very thing of cattle herding, to invent the whole nomadic cattle horseback lifestyle, well, chariot back, well, horse-driven chariots lifestyle in the case of the early Aryans, but Mongols have really inherited a lot of that culture. I would suspect that tradition transmitted down that way. I don't have any proof for that, but it would be a reasonable speculation, I think. Most steppe peoples do stuff like that at some point in time. So what I was going to say, just to finish up the story, so this war that was going on in the Aryan Voyage in the steppe region, it went on for 15 years. And when the Proto-Persians, this culture that later will become the Persians, finally left, what happened is either as a result of war, because they died, or because they took off with this new leader. A lot of the shepherd population took off from the original homeland with them. And what the warlords who were left behind, who had technically won this war, were left with, it was a territory with no, basically with no production base, with no commoners to support them, with no people to, be their wealth, to bring them wealth, to bring them food, to serve them. And so what happened is, the Persians took off in one direction, and the lords, the Aryans, having not enough resources in their homeland, they took off in the other direction, and they moved towards India, and they became the Indo-Aryans. And we talked about it when we talked about the Harappan civilization. They needed to find a new group to oppress, a new group to be the lords of. And what was left behind when both of those groups left were commoners, like the lowest of the commoners. Now they had their own category of spirits that they worship. Now we remember there are the divas, and those are the war gods of the upper class. Then we had the ahurs, which are the kind of the tonic, the earthy gods, the natural forces gods of the common shepherds. And then there were the spirit level entities known as bhogi or bogi. And that's the word from which the modern day word for God in Russian, for example, comes as Bog. These were a third class of entities, and just remember this class of entities because we will return to them when we speak about the Scythians. So these groups, they took off in different directions, and what was left on the land after them was what gave rise to later various nomadic cultures, including the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Cimmerians, and all of those people. And so they left about 14 BC plus or minus 1400. And there's that breakup of the society into two groups. It's reflected in both the Persian culture, and it's also reflected in the Indian culture today. Well, in Persian culture, it used to be reflected. And there's parallel Varnas. They're called Varnas because the caste system is a little bit more detailed than the Varna system. But the Varna system, you even see it in the Celts. And I've mentioned before, you even see it in in Middle Ages European society, when you have your lords, your knights, basically, who do the war. You have your church that does the religious duties, and you have your commoners, peasants, who are considered to be basically the workers of the land, and it's almost like a social agreement. You see the same thing in Celts with their druids and so forth. To a certain degree, it's lost in the Greek or Roman world. In the Irish world, it seems to be mostly lost, that kind of breakup, but it is very prominent in the Indian and the Persian tradition. So these main Varnas are, in India, is Brahmin, Kshatri, and Vaishya. And Brahmin being the priest, the Kshatri being the warrior class, of course, the Vaishya being everybody else, basically, the merchants, the land workers, people who don't do either war or religion. And of course, later when they conquered the local peoples, and when other peoples kind of slid down to the bottom of society, they added from the bottom to that three-layer system was the lowest class, and that's the Shudri. Now, the Persians, they also had originally 3 Varnas, and they wound up with 4 in the end of the story. But they added in a different place. So they had their priest class, and those were the Atravan. They had their warrior class, and those were the Shapatravan. And then they had the lowest, not lowest, just different class, the merchant, again, the herders, the land workers class, and that was a Vastrishan. But they added a 4th class to their system. They added it right between the priest class and the warrior class. And these were supposed to be intellectuals and people who were in charge of keeping records, of writing. They were basically bureaucrats and scientists, and not quite religious, but still people of intellectual work, and they were called the Deperan. And the big difference between those two societies, well, one big difference is that they hated each other because they both mutually considered each other to be devil worshippers. And that would be part of the problem in the Greek-Persian wars later, because Greeks, by Persian point of view, are devil worshippers as well, because they sacrifice cows to their gods. And, Zeus basically being Indra, even though he's called Deus, was looked at very suspiciously by the Persians. But the Indian gods, definitely in the Indian class system to the Persians, they were the devil worshippers, and vice versa. Because in Indian culture, the Ahuras, these chthonic entities, they became the demons of the world. They became the evil, the dark, the monstrous creatures. To where to the Persians, they took with them, the Persians took with them one of the warrior brothers. They took the most reasonable one. They took Mitra. And the way that they explained it is that Mitra, saw the wrongness of the warrior ways, and because he was the most reasonable one, the one in charge of peace and a kind of agreement and keeping oath and things like that, that he basically came to Ahura Mazda and he decided to side with that, was the good, was the order. To where his brother Indra went was, and his other brother Ruda, they went with the chaos and destruction and death and senseless warfare. But in the Indian society, there's no way really to move between the castes. There's between the varnas, there's a very rigid system on who can marry whom. And if you marry outside of that system, you become the untouchables. That's how the untouchables are formed, is when you marry somebody who's outside of your assigned class. So, for example, the Brahmins can only marry other Brahmins, and once in a while, maybe take a wife from the warrior class, to where the warrior class, there's very strict regulations on whom you can marry and procreate with, and there's no way for you to change your varna throughout your life. If you're born into the warrior class, that's what you do until the day you die. That's what your children do, your children do, and so forth. In the Persian system, you could actually change your classes. You could go, you basically could pass a special exam. And if you, for example, let's say you were a warrior and you've been fighting and fighting, and you saved up lots of money, and you want to now become a trader, and you want your children to become traders because you just started a war and you have all this wealth. Well, you could, step down and basically pass an exam and be incorporated into the merchant community and change. Or you could switch. Let's say you're a merchant and you're very warlike. Well, you could actually pass a special exam, and if you accept it, you could become one of the warriors. Or let's say you're really bright and you have religious proclivities. Well, you could become either a priest, or you could become Debaran, an intellectual class, and you could improve your lot that way. So in that sense, for a long time in the Persian Empire, there was a lot of flexibility, comparatively speaking, between those different social statuses. And I think we're about out of time. And so we're going to be doing the Persians for a while. I think we're going to be doing them for at least another 2 episodes, because I have a lot of material on them. And we just started to touch the basis of how Zoroastrianism as a religion was formed and what it was a protest against. So does anybody have any questions or concerns or anything?
Not a question, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a little bit of glare on your face from playing with the lighting. But yeah, Persians, I figured would take a little bit of time.
Yeah, even getting into them. Anyone else?
So what you're just speaking of is, so the Persians had essentially developed a meritocracy.
Yep.
Where you could socially you could socially move based upon what you did and what you based upon your merit.
Correct. Absolutely. Anyone else?
I actually do have a question. This is actually about math, oddly enough. I've heard that some of our modern methods of math actually go back to Persian culture, but I don't really know anything about that.
That is correct. And also some of it goes back to Babylonian mathematics. But as far as the Persians go, because I want to get through the, it's really important to me to describe Zoroastrianism in kind of as much detail as possible, so people understand what this religion was about, because it's usually thought as a very kind of obscure, kind of mostly stupid, senseless, kind of confusing thing. And it's actually a religion that makes a lot of sense. To me personally, if I had to choose, I probably would lean towards Zoroastrianism rather than anything else. I mean, if you can go without eating beef, it's probably pretty decent. And we're talking about very early Zoroastrianism. Now, of course, what it became later, towards the end of the Persian Empire, was a whole different story, and it wasn't quite as appealing to anyone. But no, so I want to get to the religious aspects, and then we will talk about their social achievements, because they did achieve quite a bit. They did achieve quite a bit, but a lot of the stuff, as far as mathematics goes, is what they took from the early Babylonian achievements, really, once they took over the Babylonian and the former Syrian Empire imperial lands and their intellectual knowledge. David, I think, wants to jump in.
Yes, just a couple of things. In other Indo-European cultures, like Europe and stuff, those, let's call them class senates, the Varnas, there was some upward mobility possible, mostly as a warrior. the Persians locked it in with those exams in much the same way the Chinese would with their own civil service exams. And then just a couple of other things on the religion, because it is, Zoroastrian was really the first great prophet religion. And the duality of good versus evil basically comes from it. And his revelation explains why in later Persian times there would be the fire temples and all that kind of thing. And Zoroastrianism was the foundations for a much more tolerant way of running an empire than, say, the Syrians, because the Persians were remarkably tolerant with the many, many groups they would rule over. That's pretty much all I have.
So basically, because there's so much material and it's so little known, you know, I can't really kind of summarize on it. I've got about halfway through we haven't even touched on the Zoroastrian, the doctrine, on their basically cultural practices as far as the religion goes, on their beliefs, on their do's and don'ts, on their sins, on their worldview, on their view of other entities and other people. So I would like to finish that up on the next episode, and then maybe after that we can move on to the really exciting stuff that was happening once these people meandered out of their original homeland and started actually making a name for themselves in what used to be the Syrian Empire, because boy, did they make a name for themselves. They definitely had very interesting, very colorful, and they were very, because their religion was so much focused on no senseless destruction, no asceticism, and basically no stupid, weird, strange human behavior. Just tried to do stuff that's basically decent. And because they were so tolerant of anybody who did not worship devils, sacrifice people or cows to anybody, they were very successful for a very long time, until they finally came to a point where they stopped being tolerant, where they stopped being all-inclusive. And that's pretty much what killed the Persian Empire in the end. But so yeah, unless somebody else has something else to say, I think I would propose we would meet up on March 11th, if that works for everyone.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just kind of curious. Did they maintain? You spoke earlier of their. They had a recognition that the earth and what came from the earth had, if you will, a spirit and a soul.
Mm-hmm.
Did they maintain that?
They did until the very last reincarnation of their empire, when they stopped maintaining anything and became a fanatical, almost monotheistic, very oppressive religion, unfortunately, towards the end. But for most part during the Persian Empire, yes, that was the center of their belief. The worship of fire, not the worship of fire, the reverence towards fire, towards water, towards any natural forces. Like some of the main, things that you just did not do was you do not spit in the fire. You do not even breathe in the fire if you can help it. Do not desecrate it with your breath. You don't, run your sewage into the water. You don't desecrate the earth by burying your dead in it, and you don't desecrate the air by burning your dead. So that's why they practiced the sky burials, which is basically was the exposure. The towers of silence is where you would put they had no reverence for the dead body, because they considered it to be just flesh, because the spirit has already left. They really had almost a computer-like system that the soul was almost like I'm just going to go into this real quick and we'll stop there. But I mean, their idea was that Ahura Mazda, their greater deity, existed in this special place where the word paradise really comes from. It's a garden on earth, or it's a garden somewhere in the stratosphere, where it's a place of song, and that there were kept the hard copies of all the human souls. And so when a human was born and wandered off to this planet, they took a backup copy of their soul with them, and was like a little flash drive they carried around that they wrote all of their life experiences on. And then when you die, you go back there, you update your hard copy soul with the new information you have obtained. It's kind of interesting. So to them, the bodies were really just outer suits. They were basically meat suits. And so when a person died, they needed to. They didn't want to desecrate the earth. They didn't want to desecrate the air. So only the very hearty stomach of pure and ritually infallible, innocent angels, dogs, and they really did believe that dogs were pretty much angels, that they were that they were sacred, that they were absolutely pure. Only the dogs and like basically pure and ritually clean scavenger birds could get rid of that yucky dead flesh. That was kind of a gross thing. So yeah, they were very environmentally minded, is what I'm trying to say.
Remember, all dogs go to heaven.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. So then thank you very much. And I will see you all and on March 11th. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Be well.
You too. Bye.
Orange glow of a campfire, pale electrical glow. Both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.